Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Reverend Steve Andrews. We conclude our study of the book of Nahum with chapter 3. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey. The crack of the whip, the rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies, and all for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Behold, I am against you, declares Yahweh of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face. And I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you and treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. And all who look at you will shrink from you and say, Wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile with water around her, her rampart sea and water her wall? Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limit. Put and the Libyans were her helpers, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity, her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men lots were cast, and all her great men were bound in chains. You also will be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. All your fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, your troops are women in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. Draw water for the siege, strengthen your forts, go into the clay, tread the mortar, take hold of the brick mold. There will the fire devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust, multiply like the grasshopper. You increased your merchants more than the stars of the heavens. The locust spreads its wings and flies away. Your princes are like grasshoppers, your scribes like clouds of locusts, settling on the fences in a day of cold. When the sun rises, they fly away. No one knows where they are. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains, with none to gather them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you. For upon whom has not come your unceasing evil? This is the word of the Lord. So this book, much as it began, really, ends with this great devastation spoken by Yahweh over Nineveh, over the nation of Assyria, Nineveh being its capital. If you have children that you're working on with this text, this is a tough one. There's a lot of imagery here, but a lot of it is imagery that most of us are uncomfortable sharing with little kids. Now, honestly, there is some of it that they would get, but just some difficulty. My encouragement to you is read your child the text. If they have questions, let them ask questions. And you can encourage them yourself by asking them a question or two from the text that you think that they are prepared to handle, and just go from there. Let your kids' questions be a helpful guide when you study the Bible with them, especially if you're left kind of floundering for what to talk about. All right, so the word woe is the beginning. Woe is a word of condemnation. Most of the time it gets used, like Matthew 23, as Jesus is talking about the woes upon the Pharisees and the scribes, and he speaks 7 woes, words of condemnation against them. God is condemning Assyria for her evils. And you can see some of them, right? Bloody city, so they've shed much blood. They've killed many. That's coming back in verse 3. They're full of lies. Plunder is a reference to the theft as they've killed people. There's no end to their prey except what we just saw yesterday in verse 13 in chapter 2, that God is going to put an end to their prey, to their killing of others. Verse 2 and 3 give us this picture of their destructive power, of the strength of their military. So you've got cracking whips, the wheels, the horses, the chariots, the charge. You've got the swords and the spears. Israel doesn't have most of this. They don't have horses to fight with. They don't have their own chariots. They don't have, in many parts of Israel's history, they don't even have weapons like swords to fight with as they battle, which makes it all the more impressive when you think that they win so many military victories because God is fighting for them. Verse 3 also, the great wickedness, all the murder that they have committed. They stumble over the bodies. There are so many. Not sure you want to use this analogy, but you can picture it yourself here. Well, you can probably picture what the scriptures teach, but if you want something on the kids level, you think of all the toys that might be in your house, that there are so many toys that it's hard to not trip over as you walk. Sometimes it's impossible not to step on or trip over them. And here that's a picture of death being given because that's how great their wickedness is. Verse 4 is a little trickier to know. There could be 3 different references here in verse 4 to what this whoring of the prostitute is talking about. It could be general idolatry. That's the way it's often talked about of Israel in the Old Testament, that God is the husband, Israel is the bride, the church, just as we talk about with Christ and the church in the New Testament. And so whenever Israel is unfaithful, whenever they chase after other gods, it's talked about as though they've committed adultery, that they've broken the commandment. They've whored, they've committed prostitution. Both of those phrases used of Israel, certainly. However, the weakness there is that is of Israel. This is not. Assyria has never viewed Yahweh as their God, their husband. So it's possible that that's it, but I don't know. The second is just as we had so much 5th commandment sin in verse 3, now we have so much 6th commandment sin. That could easily be spoken of the culture in which we live and you are fighting to prepare your children to live in. Or, the third option here is that it's a specific reference to one of the gods of the Assyrians, a goddess by the name of Ishtar. Within the worship of Ishtar, there were very specific sexual acts that would be committed, just as was true of many ancient false gods. Sexual activity was part of worshiping them. So that's another possibility. But the picture stands the same. That here you have this woman who is both graceful and charming, but deadly so. Right? This is not a faithful woman who's going to care for her husband or for her children. This is a woman who seeks destruction and ruin of the people that she would be with. And that's the picture here of Assyria. So, the metaphor standing out, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. So Assyria has drawn up alliances, with other nations and then betrayed them. It looked good not on paper, they didn't have paper. It looked good in thought. But Assyria did not keep their word. That's certainly a possibility here. That's the way I'm leaning with understanding of the text myself. Verse 5 is a repetition also of chapter 2, verse 13 from yesterday, God declaring that he is against them. And then it ends with the idea of shame, that he's going to lift up their skirts over their face. Nations will look at them in shame, in their shame. Nakedness in Scripture is referred to as shame ever since the fall. Not pre-fall, but ever since Adam and Eve have broken creation. They go from being content with who God has made them to be, to being ashamed of it. That nakedness reveals our sinfulness. And you see that comparison here as well. That their nakedness would be revealed, their shame would be revealed, their wickedness, their sinfulness would be made known to all the nations. Although by the end of the text, it's pretty clear it already is known to all the nations. God is going to make them, verse 6, a warning to others. Almost an example, a spectacle. People are going to watch, they're going to observe, and again, it's a warning to them not to act similarly. Verse 7, no one will come to Assyria's aid when Yahweh destroys them. Even though she's powerful as a nation, she is not loved by others. There will be no one to grieve for her. God compares Assyria to Thebes in verses 8 through 10. Thebes being a mighty nation in northern Africa on the Nile River, very strong defense against the sea, and then these allies are mentioned: Cush, Egypt, Put, the Libyans. There's great strength in this place, and yet God overthrows the proud. God tears down those who seek after their own desires, their own strength. And so Thebes became an exile, was taken into captivity, defeated. The reference that her honored men lots were cast is the idea of enslavement. That those who conquered Thebes, they cast lots. It's like rolling dice to decide who gets what. And so they rolled dice to decide who gets to take which men as their slaves, as their servants. Assyria will be drunken, they'll go into hiding, they'll seek refuge, but there won't be any refuge. And then it's shown in verse 12 that they're not strong at all. There are many fortresses, the strength that they say that they have. Shake a fig tree, watch the figs fall. That's Assyria. How quickly they will fall. If you've ever seen a fruit tree at that point, and you think of shaking the tree and having the fruit fall off, that's the picture here. Verse 13, that their troops are women in their midst, is a reference to just the gender difference, the idea that men are stronger than women. So it would be like going into battle at that disadvantage. The gates are open. Gates are a defensive posture. If your gate is closed, your enemies have a harder time getting in. If your gate is closed, thieves cannot break into your city and destroy. And yet their gates are going to be wide open because the Lord will make it so. He encourages them, or more dares them, I guess you could say, in verse 14, to prepare for themselves for battle. So strengthening their forts, taking up water for themselves for that time of siege. You need to have plenty of water on hand and food on hand, too, to survive a lengthy, drawn-out siege. So God is daring them, but then very clearly in verse 15 says that they will be destroyed. They will lose everything. They will be devoured like a locust would devour. So picture the locusts. When a swarm of locusts comes through a field, they eat everything. They pick the field clean, and there's nothing plant living left. Plant living, bit of a different way to say it, but the scriptures don't talk about plants being alive as it does people or animals. So the green plants of the field, or the harvest, the crop, being completely eaten by the locust, and that's what's going to be like for Assyria. They'll be completely wiped out by God here. They have increased. So there's another strategy of war, right? Just outnumber your opponents. Continue to produce more and more people, more and more children, to the point where they outnumber the stars of the heavens. Now there's a simple question that you can point your children to elsewhere in Scripture. Does that sound like a familiar promise that you've heard God make to someone else? It's a promise God made to Abraham back in the book of Genesis, that his children, his people, would be as numerous as the stars of the heavens. if one could count them. It's a promise God kept, too, in making Israel into its own nation. Verse 17 and 18 give you this picture of leaders, both, it says princes, whether that's, you think of a king or you think of a military leader, both of those might be wrapped up there. And then you also have the scribes, which is a little bit more like the leaders of faith. And regardless, though, church and state, however you want to picture this, the leaders are missing. Just like the locust flies away when the sun rises and no one can find the locust any longer. You're not going to find your leaders either. They're gone. And there's no one that can defend against this. People are scattered. The shepherds are worthless. All right, a shepherd protects sheep from their enemies. And here the enemy is coming against Assyria, and their shepherds, their leaders, who should protect them, aren't even going to be aware that it's happening. It's going to happen so quick they'll be taken by surprise. Verse 19. Well, actually 18 still. With none to gather the scattered people, so no future king. It's a strong word there. Verse 19. The world hated Assyria. There's no one who has not faced Assyria as evil, so when everyone hears the news that Assyria is being destroyed or has been destroyed, they're going to clap. They're going to rejoice that Assyria is no more. That's how hated they are. Now, that does wrap up the text, but as you look at a text like this, one of the questions you could work with children, as this is a text about how God is going to fight against the enemies of his people, you can talk about our enemies today. What enemies do we have that God fights against for us? Now, try to steer away from answers about people in this world. We learn specifically in the New Testament, thinking about, for example, Paul's writings in Ephesians, I think it's chapter 6, that our battle is not with flesh and blood. Our enemies are not people in this world. Our enemies are sin, death, and the devil. And God has fought against those enemies for us, and he has overcome them. He has defeated them. So there's a wondrous gospel tie-in for you to focus on with your family. Again, if you're having trouble focusing on the actual theme of this chapter, what's going on in the text, and the darker imagery that's a little more advanced, just read through the text. Note to your children that God is defending his people, because Assyria was hurting his people, Judah, and then ask how God defends us. There's a great way to handle this text with your little ones.